Hello, everyone. I am Stephani Estes. I'm the Chief Media Officer here at Goodway Group. I am joined by Jay Friedman, CEO of Goodway Group, and Dr. Augustine Fu, who leads Fu Analytics. And we are here to talk with you today about a topic that is very near and dear to our hearts, which is how you can use programmatic excellence to drive greater business outcomes for your clients. So today we're going to be sharing some learnings from research that Goodway Group and Fu Analytics partnered on. And we're going to show you how to hack the system to outsmart ad fraud and get an unfair advantage over your competition. So to start off, we're actually going to ask for some inputs from you. So on your screen, you will be seeing a QR code for a Mentimeter, and also it has been dropped in the chat. You'll see a couple of questions there about ad fraud that we're curious to get your take on. And I think in a moment here, we might even be able to see the results.
Hopefully we can see some live results. There we go.
There we go. Okay. I love watching these populate in real time so you can see how it's going. So the first question is around what percentage of your programmatic buys are going to waste. What's interesting right now is so far everything is north of 30%.
Is that like a Price is Right hedging strategy?
I think so.
Yeah,
We've got savvy people on the webinar.
Yeah, well, I'd like to see if, for the folks that think that it's 30% plus, and Matt, you might want to just drop the link in the chat again for those who have just joined. Oh, well, there's a QR code, so no need. Or there's the top, menti.com, 55763091. But yeah, for the folks who are saying 30% plus, like, it's interesting. I'd be interested in knowing, like, is that what you're seeing reported? Is that just a guess? Like, it'd be interesting to know the thoughts and the rationale behind that.
And one other nuance is what percentage of your programmatic buys are going to waste, not what percentage of ad fraud there is out there generally. So that could be another nuance that people should be aware of.
Yeah, informed guess. Oh man, we're gonna talk about some of this stuff here. So
yeah, and I'll tell you, Debbie, and that's a great comment about identifying the bots, because whenever I talk to Fu, I'm reminded that I overgeneralize and say like fraud or bots, and it's not all fraud or bots. There's humans viewing stacked ads and pixel, and pixel stuffing, and there are bots viewing MFA, and there's MFA to humans, and there's so many different kinds. And so, but I'll tell you, if there's anybody who can identify bots, it's one of the three of us on this call, and it's not Stephani or me. All right.
Well, glad to be working with you all to look at data.
Yeah.
Let's go to the next question here. So this is okay. So we saw from there, most of you are feeling 30+% in the programmatic fraud realm there. So then what is the biggest challenge to reducing waste? And I believe this is going to be a word cloud for us to see. I think we can put identifying bots, as Debbie helpfully shared there in the chat. That's certainly one. Bots, yep, right there, right front and center.
Very fair.
Yeah. Yeah, identification, manpower is an important one there.
Yeah, productivity.
Yep.
Or proactivity, the ability to be proactive, sorry. It's interesting how they just rearrange themselves. It's pretty cool. Okay.
I love watching word clouds.
Yeah.
All right. So we owe too much media, incremental value.
MFAs. Yep.
Yep.
Yep. And the question is, what's the biggest challenge to reducing waste? It's not necessarily just fraud or just bots or whatever it is. So that's, the wording here is interesting. And Russell from ADAM suggested the SPO the biggest challenge, which, yeah, I mean, SPOs are an entire category that encompasses some of these various things. So that's interesting. All right.
All right. Okay, so let's jump right in here, because obviously there's a lot of different topics that this could cover, and a lot of different types of fraud. And so, as I mentioned, and we have the QR code at the very beginning for you to download this white paper. If you haven't, we can certainly make sure you get the opportunity to get it. But I want to start by asking you both sort of, why did we decide to undertake this research? And I'm just going to put it out there. Why should we trust this group right here to be talking about that topic?
Well, I'll start. I mean, years and years ago, Fu and I were talking, and I felt like we took away a lot of practices on what we needed to do to minimize fraud. And we built those into the algorithm that we use to buy Programmatic, and we had done a pretty good job, and we had tested it against a bunch of different tools, and so we felt pretty good about it. And then it started to surface. It's the fraud talk and even before the MFA stuff started to surface again. And I called Fu and I was like, "What's the deal here?" I was like, "Why are people still struggling with this?" And you, as you told me, you were like, "Because it's a mess." And I said, "Well, are we a mess? I thought we solved some of this." And so you were very kind. You said, "You could be better, and you're better than most, but you could be better." And what I loved, and I'd like you just to talk about real quickly, is just your attitude of like, it doesn't matter what you did yesterday. The fear of finding out thing is really irrelevant. All that matters is you're going to buy media from this minute on. What are you going to do with it?
Yeah, I mean, basically, if you can overcome the fear of finding out, then you can actually do better. So I think one of the things that people need to realize is that we're all up against very clever bad guys, right? So they will do everything they can to maximize their own profit, and they will have tools available to them to very well disguise their bots. So fraud evolves over the years. It doesn't stay static. So yes, you might have taken some steps years ago, but you need to stay vigilant and keep up with how the bad guys are evolving their fraud and their crime. So I think, some basic things that we've observed over the last 15 years is that, we started out buying display ads on websites. And at that time, that was like 15 years ago. So at that time, those websites needed traffic. So they just went out and bought traffic. So you've seen my quote, bought traffic, BOUGHT equals bought traffic, BOT traffic, because there's not a whole bunch of humans sitting around with nothing to do but to go to your website when you tell them to, right? So I think in those cases, that was a long time ago, but obviously now the spend has evolved, have shifted into video ads, and then mobile apps, mobile web, and now CTV. So wherever the biggest bucket of money is, the bad guys are going to go. And the techniques also evolve with that, right? So they made a lot higher CPMs when they were faking the video ads. Now they're making even higher CPMs when they're faking the CTV ads. So I think it's really about having the right tools in place to look at the data and being vigilant about it. And that's how you can continue to improve. And even if you had done not so great a job in the past, there's room for improvement, and everyone can do a better job in digital.
I love that attitude towards it, and we've had a lot of conversations, because I know that there's been talk about this idea of FOFO, the fear of finding out. Yep. And what that does is, it, like, as a fraudster or someone who's making money off of that, I have to love that attitude, because that's basically saying, continue about your business over here, defrauding the rest of us. Like, we're not interested in making any changes. And so I think what was really interesting about the white paper that you all put together, and I want to get into what that research shows and what we learned from that, is that there are ways to be able to dig in and find out so that you can make those changes. And so let's talk a little bit more about what we learned from the research that we did together.
Yeah, well, I learned that Fu is 100% correct. Fraud had evolved. Yeah, strep throat ain't what it used to be 100 years ago. I'll tell you that much. And so, yeah, so number one, it had evolved. Number two, he's 100% right in that, I think a lot of times people equate programmatic with display, which is just quite antiquated, and fraud being equated with display is equally antiquated because it just follows the money. And it's an incredibly efficient market at following the money, by the way. And so, I think what we learned was, and this was what I really started to like about the Foo Analytics product, is when we were using more traditional or more well-known vendors per se, they told us, well, you can buy pre-bid. Well, Foo just went right into why pre-bid pretty much doesn't do anything. And I didn't fully understand that. If you could explain that, like, what does pre-bid not do?
Sure. So basically, we have to understand the concept of declared versus detected. So anything that you can declare, you can imagine, like literally put yourself in the shoes of the bad guy. You can say whatever the hell you want, right? Because it's just declared, right? It's not actually detected with a JavaScript tag. So at the time of the bid request or before the bid happens, everything in the bid request is declared. So for example, if you're a fraudster and you know that your domain was blocked already, what would you do? You'd simply lie and put someone else's domain in there because you can do that and get away with it. You'd still have your own seller ID in there because you want to get paid. But a lot of people, including the networks and the DSPs, don't necessarily check for that after the fact because everyone's happy. We want more volume, so they don't do the extra work unless somebody insists. So that kind of very simple domain spoofing is still going on, right? So, it really boils down to, at the time of the pre-bid request, you don't have enough verified data to use to catch most of the fraud, right? You're pretty much catching the bad guys who messed up and forgot to disguise their domain. So that kind of stuff.
Why wouldn't the technology that, the world's largest advertisers are using today, how does it not see through? And if you say that you're coming from goodsite.com or whatever, how does it not see through in the bid request that that's not true?
Well, I actually don't know how they could make such simple mistakes, but if you remember from 2022, if you remember from 2022, there was a mistake done by Gannett where some of the bid requests that originated from usatoday.com were declared to be local newspapers like the Tennessean.com, and then vice versa. It's like, how does that mistake happen if the code was done properly? And then more recently, literally last month, the www3.forbes, right? So in that case, it was a subdomain of the main domain. And a lot of people just kind of, when they see Forbes.com, they just ignore the subdomain. But we've actually seen for years that the bad guys are pretty clever. They won't commit the MFA fraud, like loading too many ads on the page on the main site. They will use a subdomain to do it. And if people just assume that the subdomain is pretty much the same as the main domain, then they get away with it. So I think it's really about noticing those details and having the right tools in place so that you can see that. Now, some of the legacy fraud verification companies did catch that, but basically they just considered, oh, it's on the same domain, right? Whether it's a subdomain or not, we don't consider that domain spoofing because the MRC standards didn't tell us we had to, right? So those are the kinds of loopholes. They're getting off on a technicality, but I think advertisers are getting smarter than that, and we really need to look at more of those details to then say, okay, well, the subdomain was where the fraud happened and the main site wasn't.
Yeah, well, if you ask me where I live and I say I live on 8th Avenue and you say, okay, good enough, I have a good idea for where you live. There, as far as I know, there are many, many different parts of 8th Avenue, and that's not probably descriptive enough. Steph, you were gonna.
Yeah, well, so I want to I think there's a very big sort of like a behavior change that has to happen with traders when we think about this, right? Because as you're talking about why pre-bid isn't enough, I think back to when a lot of the legacy verification partners came along and the story was, don't worry, we'll get it out before you even pay for it, before you bid on it. Like, we're going to take care of this. And as I know, Jay likes to refer to that as sort of like the guarantee fairy. And, I think it all made us feel very good and warm and fuzzy because we were like, oh, okay, great. We've sort of checked that box.
Yep.
And now we're good. And I think, as you mentioned at the top of this webinar, that fraud is constantly changing and we have to keep, there is no sort of easy button for that. But I want to, so there's a behavior change that has to happen, and that we have to realize that there's value in that post-bid data that we get that helps us do a better job of eliminating that waste. But one thing I'm curious to get both of your takes on, so especially as we think about a situation like Forbes, right? Yes, I've heard all those arguments where it's like, well, it doesn't quite fall under this particular definition of invalid traffic and blah, blah, blah. Regardless of whether or not it was detected, it was fraudulent and it was not showing up where we intended for it to show up. So knowing that the sneaky guys are intentionally sneaky and that they are trying to hide it, how do we think about having more excellence in programmatic, and how do we look for those signals that allow us to catch what might be fraud before it becomes a major problem?
Very basic, right? You basically want your own feedback loop to know whether the ad went to where you wanted it to go, right? So you might have pre-bid filters, you might have all these other things to supposedly prevent the fraud, but if you don't have a way to check that yourself, you can't rely on it, right? So when we're dealing with bad guys, right, and everyone else is a middleman, so they're not necessarily committing the fraud, but they're certainly allowing the fraud to flow through their systems, right? Mm-hmm. So no one is really going to be checking for you, and unless you care yourself to take the action to look at the analytics yourself, nobody's going to do that proactively, because it just means less revenue for them, right? So their incentives are misaligned with yours. So just to kind of make this a little bit more concrete, you mentioned the term pre-bid filtering or blocking versus post-bid detection. Yeah. So if the fake site knew that their domain was blocked by everybody, they would just lie and put some other domain in there like marthastewart.com. Okay. The point is, even the log level data and the placement reports that you get from your DSP will have recorded marthastewart.com, what was declared in the bid request, because they don't run a post-bid JavaScript to detect where the ad actually went. So if you have your own post-bid JavaScript, like the Foo Analytics in ad tag, we can now detect where the ad actually went. And if there's a mismatch, right, we detected it went to fake site 123, but they told us it was supposed to go to marthastewart.com. When we see that discrepancy, we know they lied to us, right? And so those become the signals that we use to say, oh, if they're lying to us, what else are they lying to us on, right? They're using bot traffic and not telling us. They're, doing ad stacking. So all of that is how we close the loop, by using a post-bid JavaScript to actually detect what went on.
Yeah, so I have a question then, and then maybe an answer to Stephanie's question as well. So if it's my sole business, theoretically, to detect ad waste, and there are companies that have 300 or 500 times more employees than you do. And I'm not asking you to speak on their behalf, but if you had to guess, what makes it such that they don't implement post JavaScript into their tag?
They can. All of them have post-bid JavaScript tags, but they make it as an option for their customers. And they say, oh, we'll have to charge you for that. And so what do you think a lot of customers do? They opt to not pay for it because they believed that the pre-bid filtering took care of it. You see what I'm saying? So a lot of them say, oh, why are we going to pay for this extra stuff if pre-bid supposedly took care of it? So that's kind of like the other kind of best practice I can now surface is like, don't assume, literally check it yourself, right? If you just assume that the pre-bid works, it may not be, right? So I'll use a stat from Item, right? The new DSP AIDEM. On a daily basis, they look through 330 billion bid requests or opportunities for ad impressions. They filter that down to 10 billion. So they're basically taking out 97% of the obviously bad stuff. So then you're only bidding on the 10 billion. That's still a very large number, but consider all that they're taking out. If you're not doing that kind of stuff, right? Imagine bidding on any one of those 330 billion per day, you're getting screwed, right? So the levels of fraud and the levels of fraudulent activity that the bad guys can generate, it's truly scalable fraud here in digital.
Yeah, and there's a lot of duplication in there as well that may not necessarily be straight fraud, but but
correct.
I
It's
think
still waste. And if
it
you
is
didn't
waste.
have a filter for that, yeah, you'd basically be bidding against yourself and costing yourself more money, right? So there's a lot of those kind of problems that are just baked into the way things are done right now.
So let me go back to the word cloud and to answer your question, Stephanie. Like, I think even if you are the biggest advertiser on the planet and you've in-housed all of your programmatic work, I still don't know that it's the right thing for you to do to in-house fraud expertise fully. In other words, to have someone whose full-time job is to be at your level. Right? I think there is huge value in having a COE type person whose job it is to liaise with you and ensure that everything's getting done. But I think, and I'll compliment you for you because you don't need to compliment yourself. But I'm 6 degrees short, 6 college degrees short of and many states away from where you got your degrees. And so I think it's number one, it's important to help people understand this is not something that you should ever have to expect your internal team to just know and handle. So that's number one. Number two, this is not feasible for every trader on their own, even if they can work with you, even if they have a center of excellence who can guide them to manually implement all of the things that are required to keep up with fraud. There has to be some automated algorithmic way at the seat level to do these things.
So let me get into kind of the work I do day to day. And, I'm glad to have the opportunity to collaborate with you all on this because it really is about analyzing live campaigns to then see what is going right and what is going wrong. Because sometimes we will notice in these new campaigns a new form of fraud that we never noticed before, right? So again, like we said, fraud evolves. So I can cite a few examples from over the years, right? I'm sure that a lot of these legacy fraud verification companies have very talented data scientists. They have very talented JavaScript coders, right? They can do all of the basic tech that I do. But unless they are reviewing campaigns with clients daily, they're going to misinterpret some of the data. Okay, so let me give you a very simple example. Say frequency caps. If you see, oh, well, there's like 300 to 500 ads being shown to the same person. If you don't understand the context of the campaign setup, you won't understand whether that's good or bad, right? If you understand that the campaign had frequency caps set of 3 to 5, then of course, when you see 300 to 500, okay, something's wrong. The frequency caps are not being enforced for you. Okay. But on the other hand, if you're an advertiser that says, oh, we're going to set a frequency cap of 300 to 500 per month, then what you see in the data, given the context, is perfectly fine, right? It's not a violation. So same thing with fraud. You can actually see a ton of data, but you may actually not understand either how the tech works or whether it's correct or not without reviewing it with your clients. And that's also why I've left Foo Analytics in a non-automated way, right? Non-automated fashion, because too often the algorithms just make a mistake. And then you say, oh, we want to block everything that's above 3% fraud level. Okay, so then in that particular case, right, I've shared this example before. We had a client that was running on peopleonespanol.com. Okay, it had 30% problematic traffic. Okay, but they said, and then the question was, do you want to turn off peopleonespanol.com? They said, no, we understand that, about 30% is going to waste, but our Hispanic audience still goes there. So we're not going to turn off that domain. So by being an analytics platform and providing you the data, the clients, the advertisers can make the business decision themselves about that, right? It's not just, it's greater than 3% fraud or IVT, therefore we block it automatically. So there's a level of understanding. It's kind of like how to use Google Analytics. You apply some of that experience to looking at the analytics to then better optimize your campaigns.
Well, and what I love about your platform is, and like I'm sounding like a commercial, you should be recording this and you can just can run it on you can run it on real CTV, not fraud, and it'll be great. No, but so you could click on people on Espanol, then it'll just sort within your system to only show you that. Then you can click on problematic traffic and you can see where the bulk is coming from and block that without blocking people in Espanol altogether. So
potentially. Remember
right.
the Forbes thing, right? This fraud was happening on the subdomain. So yes, you can
Right.
just block that. But sometimes when it's all mixed in, I'll even say some of the mainstream publishers, they don't have zero fraud. They don't have zero bots because like the New York Times, there'll always be bots coming to steal their content, right? So there's always some level that's going to be there, as long as you have a way to see what it is and where it's coming from.
Yeah, but you could block people in Espanol when it's coming from Ashburn, Virginia. Right, like you can go in
things like that you can do. Yes, so some of that you can actually deploy to your pre-bid filtering. So that should have been taken out, right? So again, it's like, how do we close the loop? You know, because you don't want to assume that the pre-bid filtering is working. You want to have your own way of checking it. That's why we have to run the post-bid JavaScript. So then that gets to another point that a lot of advertisers should ask of their verification vendor. What portion of the data did they actually measure with a JavaScript tag?
Oh, yeah.
Because I can tell you, if they didn't measure it, they shouldn't be reporting it as audible, right? So video ads, you actually have to run JavaScript before you can detect whether the sound is on and what volume level it was. If you didn't run the JavaScript tag, you could not have detected that. So when, you know, so be very careful, ask your vendor to show you what portion of the ads were actually measured with the JavaScript tag. If they didn't measure it, whatever they're reporting to you is probably not accurate. Let me just put it that way.
So I want to give, I think this has been really helpful. And actually I want to dig in on one thing that you said there just a second ago, but I want to give the viewers here a couple of like tangible things to do so that they can think about like some next steps on the waste. And I heard a couple of things. I'm going to list them off and you all like, you know, fact check this or add to it. But one of the things I heard is as you were just saying, like using those post-bid JavaScript tags is really important because it's the only way that you can kind of verify what actually happened. Choosing a vendor that reports on the largest percentage of impressions with the deepest amount of information and the highest level of concern for fraud. So I think your point there about like, are we actually measuring the majority of the impressions and are we actually able to have that visibility? Setting frequency caps, making sure that we're keeping an eye on that. I think the other thing that we found in our white paper, and I think this goes to what you were just saying, Augustine, about like looking at and using the data to sort of triangulate next steps, is watching closely and early to figure out when those indicators of waste come about. So Jay, you mentioned like, if we can see where there's a lot of bot traffic coming from on a particular domain, rather than blocking that domain altogether, we could see that it was specifically within a particular geographic area, and we can get a lot more precise about how we are weeding that fraud out, as opposed to just applying these like really blunt object blocking, which has a number of knock-on effects, whether that's, you know, hurting smaller publishers, limiting your scale. There's a lot of opportunity for there to be further, you know, harm, I would say, within the supply chain. What are some things that I missed there? Like, what are some other things that like brands should be thinking about doing in order to eliminate waste? And actually, let me add a second level to that question. Jay, you were kind of scratching at this earlier. One of the big words we saw in the word cloud is manpower, and thinking about like, how do you manage that? And Jay, to your point, it doesn't always make sense to have somebody internally whose sole job it is to be ferreting out fraud. So how, if you're running a lean programmatic team, like how do you think about the resources that you put and how can you make that a more streamlined process?
Well, yeah, there's a couple of things. Number one, I think you have to ask the right questions of the provider. And that's one of the things, you know, that Fu and I do very similarly. Is Fu doesn't really sell his platform. He just says, here are the right questions to ask whoever you end up hiring. And I'm sure that they bend toward, you know, toward what benefits him. But the reality is they are the smart questions that you want to ask. And I do the same when we're talking to a marketer. I'm like, you know, here's what you need. Here's what I think you need to know in order to hire an agency. And I think we do a lot of those things well. But if you find someone better, go use them. That's okay. And so I think number one is you have to know the question to ask. You have to work with some provider because no brand, not the largest agency in the world, is not going to have the data science, power, knowledge, and it's not of value right, to hire those people and then try to charge for it at the brand level. If you can partner with someone like Fu here or any of the others, if they can give you what you need. So that's number one. Number two, I really recommend controlling things at the seat level. And so that's number two. Number three, I think that you have to look at combinatorial blocking. And so that's something that we do a lot of. And we actually had one of the major DSPs build that capability for us, because you don't want to block people in Espanol, but you do want to block people in Espanol from Ashburn, Virginia. Or you may not want to block all Windows 10, but you do want to block Windows 10 when it comes from this source or from this referral or whatever it is. And so, and you can even get into triplets and quads if you really want to have fun. So, so I think there are some practices there, and you just have to work with the right folks. I mean, you know, again, we've done that for ourselves. We haven't, but certainly could build that for others. Fu, anything I missed?
Yeah, I mean, you went down into the weeds, so I'm going to take it back up to the high level.
Yes, I did.
Yeah, I would just say that, you know, there may be tens of thousands of sites and apps in any particular campaign, but if a site is only eating up 50 impressions out of 50 million, it really doesn't matter, right? So what I tend to advise clients is you don't have to worry about putting in hours and hours to review tens of thousands of sites. The way we do it in the Fu Analytics interface is that we surface the top 10 bad guys for you to review first. Because if this site is eating up 10% of your impressions of your entire campaign, you need to assess them sooner than the other ones, right? So we usually surface the top 10 or 20, and then you can review all the forms of fraud that they're doing. Because typically, if they're a fraudster, we're not limited to just one kind of fraud, right? It's not just the bot traffic, like Jay was saying. They may also be sticking 100 ads in the same ad slot. They might be doing pixel stuffing. They might be refreshing the ad slot every 1 second so they can get as many impressions in as possible. So there's multiple forms of fraud that we can see. And if we see one of those domains and they're doing multiple forms of fraud, then that's a candidate for you to turn off, right? And you just check the checkbox and that adds it to a list, and then you can add that to your block list. So it's really about reviewing the top 10 to 20 bad guys first, and then doing it periodically. Because the other thing that we recommend to clients is that they don't just continuously add stuff to a block list, right? You want to add a chunk and then wait to see the effect, right? So we actually should see a stair step down in the dark red. And then after you see that change, then add the next chunk. And then just do that consistently over time, whether it's every 2 weeks, every month, whatever. So that's how we can optimize our campaigns and bring them to a much, much better state. And again, you don't have to spend ungodly hours doing this, because we have the platform to surface the stuff that you need to check first.
Right. Yeah. And I think one of the interesting things is, you know, I hear a lot of way too quickly assumed things in our industry. For instance, you know, well, but we measure attention because, you know, if someone's on the page for 8 seconds, you know, they're much more likely. And it's like, again, you're a fraudster. You think, if I'm a media buyer, what do I want to see? I want to see someone on the page for 8 seconds. It doesn't cost me very much to put a bot on the page for 8 seconds. Hence, I'm going to put a bot on the page for 8 seconds, right? But what you find is, and it would be nice if you had an analytics platform that could track whether or not the tap ever happened or the mouse ever moved, or if all the clicks just happened in rapid succession. Is there anybody who does that? See?
All right, without even saying it, yeah.
Softball.
But in fact, that actually happened. So I had an automotive company. You know, we had the measurement on the site in July of 2017. We saw the entire botnet change its behavior. So before July of 2017, they would hit the homepage and they would leave. After July of 2017, they would hit the homepage, look at 2 more pages, and leave. The entire botnet changed its behavior. And our hypothesis at that time was that we were looking at retargeting bots, right? So the retargeting platforms would say, oh, well, if they didn't do anything on the site, we don't consider that a valuable visit, right? So basically the entire botnet changes behavior. And they were generating so much volume on that site. It was like 60% of the page views on that site were from that botnet. So now they, you know, so anyway, we could actually see that kind of change. And like you said, the platform automatically flags these things to you so that you can focus your attention on what needs to be investigated. Because if everything is going fine, then you don't need to put in the work, right? The other thing you would use Foo Analytics for is basically to check that everything is running according to the specifications you put into the campaign settings, right? That's one of the key things. And for the most part, if your campaign settings are set up well and you have very tight controls like the way you guys have, there's not going to be all these panic things like, oh, we have to put out this fire, we have to put out that fire. Things should just be running smoothly at a steady state. And you can have the analytics to tell you that everything's running properly.
Yeah. And I do want to just throw out there, yes, I think at Goodway, we're doing this well, but better and better every day. But part of the reason that we have a consulting arm is that not every agency wants to call us and work with another agency, right? Like some do, some don't. But that's part of why we have a consulting arm, which is to be able to help them set this up internally and then walk away. And so I think it's just important to know, like, I mean, you can certainly work with one of the largest consultancies in the world, and it will cost you a lot of money, but there are multiple other ways to help get this set up internally if you are looking for that help.
And we can train them so they can understand, just like they learn how to use Google Analytics over the years, they can learn to use this analytics platform to keep a closer eye on their digital media. So yes, we try to help them kind of teach them how to fish.
So you both mentioned metrics and how bots change their behavior to mimic that. So here comes another really big softball. What's the best way to be thinking about measuring your campaigns in order to help eliminate optimizing towards fraud?
I'll start with what I've seen recently. So there has been a botnet that has infiltrated PMax from Google, and they are in fact faking mouse movement clicks on the landing page. So not only are they generating the ads, they're clicking through on the ads, they're also faking the movement and clicks on the landing page. So if you just had something like Google Analytics, the fact that they are staying on the page and doing something like clicking means that the bounce rate is going to be tuned far lower. So there's not going to be obvious, oh, why is the bounce rate 99 to 100%? It's going to be like very, very low because the bots actually did something else. And then even the time on site, like Jay was mentioning earlier, sorry.
No.
The time on site is, again, not necessarily a good metric because someone might have found what they're looking for very quickly and just left. They were very happy. So a low time on site is not necessarily a bad thing. And then the flip example is a very high time on site could be literally a bot deliberately sticking around. So again, it's really having other supporting information so that you can kind of triangulate and understand. So in the charts, in all the supporting data grids, when you have to do an audit, you have all these other supporting data points that then you can use to triangulate to see if that makes common sense. So I always like to tell the clients, if you can't make sense of it, if you can't understand it, something is still wrong. Or if I didn't explain it to you in a way that you can understand it, there's still something wrong, right? So the idea here is that as an analytics platform and me as a scientist, I want to show the work. I want to show the data in a way that you can actually understand why something was marked fraudulent and why something was not. So in the case of the PMax bot, we could actually see all the clicks repeatedly clicking on the same pixel on screen, right? You can't get a whole bunch of humans to repeatedly do that. So even though there was the presence of clicks, we could still tell that those were faked clicks and therefore say, okay, this is not worth us spending more money, digital budgets on.
Yeah, and I'll go out of the weeds a little bit, but
okay.
I think bots don't buy toothpaste in Walmart. They don't buy cars off the lot and then register them with the state. But they do fake a lot of things that make it look like they bought whatever you're trying to sell. And so what I would say is it's really important that you look at actual sales, not, and if you're e-com, then you can look at actual e-commerce sales, but like non-charged back, non-returned sales against what your measurement is telling you is happening. Because I'm assuming bots can fake or can navigate their way to a thank you or a confirmation page or whatever it is. So like just saying, well, we set it up and it looks good, and oh my gosh, our conversions are off the chart, like that doesn't work. And so I think it's important that you're doing just a sanity check as you go.
Yeah, I love that. I would just recommend everyone do that. Right? If it doesn't make sense or if it's too good to be true, look into it because it probably is too good to be true. Okay, so actually, I'll bring up a more advanced example here. So in the past, some of these advertisers like restaurants, right? Quick serve, Taco Bell, Pizza Hut, whatever, they would say, oh, we're only going to pay when we get footfall. Okay, that means someone actually walked into our store. So how do you think the bad guys falsified footfall? Okay, I'll let the audience think about that. I'll let you think about that for a second and I'll reveal. Okay.
I have an idea, but I'm not bold enough to guess.
Okay. How about Stephanie?
I'm gonna stay in the J camp with that one too.
So put very simply, they didn't falsify the footfall. The footfall actually occurred. They just claimed credit for it. Okay, see the difference? Okay, so basically what these networks are doing is they're buying a whole bunch of low-cost ads to make basically 330 million of the 350 million people's devices considered a exposed device, right? Meaning one that had seen the ad. So whenever any one of them walked into a Dunkin' Donuts or Taco Bell, they could say, oh yeah, we caused that. So that is falsification of the attribution, not necessarily falsification of the footfall. So a lot of that also happens with affiliate fraud and what we call remarketing fraud, where the sale already happened. They just claimed credit for it and made it look like in the data that they caused it, and there was no cause and effect whatsoever, right? And even in some of the more fraudulent cases, like in the Uber example, some of those mobile exchanges didn't even run any ads. They just claimed credit for driving the app install. Literally, they just made up the transparency reports in Excel spreadsheets and sent that. So again, you know, if you've been dealing with bad guys for as long as I have, it's like every trick is available to them. So the only way you can combat that is just be vigilant. And if you suspect anything, if anything looks too good to be true, question it, dig deeper.
Yeah.
And a nice healthy dose of skepticism.
Yeah.
Yeah. And when marketers tell me like, well, here's how we're going to measure it. And marketers and even agencies often think like, all right, we have got you cornered. Right? We're going to put this in place and this in place and this in place, and you're going to have nowhere to go. And what I'll often do is I'll say, are you open to me telling you how I would game that? Because it's totally gameable, and the smartest marketers are like, yes, actually, I would love to know that. And I'm like, okay. And it's a little bit of a war games kind of scenario, but, I will say like, I love, hopefully there's not a lot of this anymore, but like the last at scene stuff, it's like, it's pretty simple. You just make sure you have a frequency. Instead of 3 per day, you do 1 per 8 hours, right? Which is like, oh, so I have 3 different times. Because if you do 3 per day, they're all going to run at 12:02 a.m. or something like that, right? You don't want that happening. And so there's ways to game pretty much any attribution thing, unless you have the right intent, the right analytics, and then the basic metrics in place.
All right, before we move to answering some questions from the audience here, what is the one takeaway that you want everyone to walk out of this Zoom webinar with today?
Put very simply, you can do it yourself. You don't have to buy extra services. I mean, if you're vigilant and you care about it, you will find the right tools and techniques to be able to optimize your own campaigns. And I actually want to kind of shout out to a lot of small business owners who have successfully mitigated a lot of fraud without the use of any technology, right? Including they don't use mine either, but they can tell something's wrong just looking at their own Google Analytics, right? When one small business owner turned on a Google campaign, she said, oh, well, why did my Android number go up 10,000%? Okay, so something like that, if you were vigilant and you cared, you would see that and you would immediately turn it off, right? So I think very often the small business owners who are very careful with their spending are doing the best job, right? Whereas the largest of advertisers that have billions and billions of dollars they have to spend end up are being the worst victims, right? Because they're trying to buy irrational quantities of ad impressions, and the bad guys love that. Oh yeah, we'll go make up as many impressions as you want to buy. So to reiterate, just look more carefully, look more in more detail, and question everything. And that's how you're going to be able to make your digital buys better.
Yeah, and I think to your point, don't fix your budget, fix your goal. Right? Fix your business goal. We want to achieve 2% market share growth, or we want to achieve, certain category level growth. Then set that objective and back into how much it's going to take to achieve it, and make sure that it's financially profitable. But when you set your budget at $200 million a year or $1 billion a year, then the fraudsters are like, oh, sweet, how much of that can I capture? Not can I capture some, right? Yeah. In terms of the single most important takeaway, I'm going to just simply repeat what I said to my kids when they were teenagers, but this applies to ad fraud as well. It's not as safe as you think out there. You have to be vigilant. You have to be careful. You're not a bad driver. There are just other bad, So,
yes, that's right.
You're not a bad programmatic practitioner. There are just other people who are trying harder than you
to steal your money.
To steal your money, because you have more to do than they do. You have 12 areas of responsibility. They have one. Their only job is to steal your money, and that can't be your only job by the nature of how jobs are built. So it's not as safe as you think, and that's my single take.
All right. Both are good. Both have a nice, healthy paranoia sort of slant to them. So I like it.
It's not paranoia if they're really following you.
That's true. All right. I am going to open up Q&A. So if you have a question that you'd like for us to answer, please go ahead and pop that right in the Q&A box, and we will go ahead and answer those here. And if we don't have a chance to get to your questions, you're always welcome to reach out, and we'd be happy to continue the conversation. So phone lines are now open.
All right. Yeah. And this is the best kind of phone line. We're not even taking donations. Right.
I know.
So that's got to be good. Yeah. Well, I'll just start. I mean, when you speak to brands, what's the number one sign that they want to lean in? Because I'm sure you talk to brands and you quickly get this sense of they're there to protect themselves, or, so how do you sense that early?
I can tell that within 15 seconds.
Yeah.
Basically, they will say, can we put a tag in and measure something? Because, they sometimes ask me about what are the, overall fraud levels in the industry and all that. I say that's completely irrelevant, right? All that matters is what's impacting your campaign. And it entirely depends on how vigilant you are and how tight your controls are when you're doing the buying. Typically, when you see a big brand and they've handed off $200 million to a big agency, like a media company, holding company agency, the agency's there to just spend it all, right? So you typically see the loosest controls, the least amount of controls. But where I see some brands have in-house some things, they're not necessarily doing the best job, but at least they want to learn a little bit more so they can do better. So I can tell that within, literally seconds or minutes of meeting them. And usually it doesn't take more than 10 to 15 minutes for them to say, oh, we want that. We want to actually have better data than we've had before. Because if you just get one fraud percentage, like, oh, it's 1% fraud in an Excel spreadsheet, what do you do with that, right? There's nothing you can do with that. So you just need better data, more complete data for you to then act on it.
Yeah. And to be fair, to your point, I've seen a lot of these, I've seen a lot of these things where, 92% was monitored but not measured, right? And I mean, that's the equivalent of, of like you hire a pest control to go through, you have 1,000 apartments in a complex. And it's like, we monitored all 1,000 apartments. Now we only actually went in and looked at 20 of them, but the other 980 are under monitoring. It's like, no, they're not. They're not at all.
Yeah.
Right. And so that's important. We've got some good questions though, much better than my pest control analogy.
We do. I'm gonna get a couple of these. So one is, how would you recommend handling this conversation with clients if you're a smaller full service agency with limited digital expertise?
Yeah, I think I can answer that because we work with 70 agencies around the country who in many cases do have limited digital expertise, and they work with us in some form or fashion, whether or not we're buying media on their behalf. They work with us in some form or fashion to help augment and improve their practice. And so I think in those cases, you have the two layers that are important to have is number one, the expert, which is Fu or someone similar. And then number two is the interpreter who works and the agent per se, who works solely on your behalf, right? Who says, all right, Fu suggests we do these 4 things. I think we can get away with these 2 to start. Let's try that. And then we can determine if we want to add on later. And so there are a number of, Goodway certainly being one of them, but there are other companies in the space that can offer consulting services. There's also a lot of individuals, I think, out there who do have some pretty good expertise. And so, but I think it's important to find one of those and just listen and look at what it would look like to engage with them. And I also know from a smaller agency perspective, the concern is, well, how am I going to pay for that? Because my client doesn't pay for that. And that depends on if you're on FTE or if you're on straight retainer or if you're on percent of media. There's always a way to pay for things. It just, and that's something we certainly help with all the time.
What are your top 3 questions to ask a vendor to check their ad fraud verifications?
That's all you, man.
I can tell you one that I wouldn't ask, and that is, are you MRC accredited? Because MRC accreditation doesn't mean that they measure correctly. Okay, so let me be clear. I'm a fan of MRC. I'm a fan of their standards, but very precisely, the MRC accredits vendors for doing what they said they would do, not for measuring fraud correctly or not. Okay, there's a huge difference there, right? It might be subtle to most people, but basically, I would ask the vendor to show their work. And I can tell you that's why I've been so dead set against these black box vendors. Whenever you ask them to explain anything, they say, oh, well, we can't tell you because we don't want bad guys to find out. Okay, well, do you actually understand how any of that works? Or the technology that you're selling, how does it work? So I don't think a lot of the salespeople really understand how the tech works, or the account people. So that, and then like I said earlier, what portion of the ads were actually measured? Because you can't make a determination of whether it was audible or not if you didn't run a JavaScript tag. So I think one of the first things an advertiser can do if they're already using one of these vendors is have them show them a report to say what portion of the ads were actually measured with the JavaScript tag versus the total quantity. And very often the advertiser is paying for the total quantity because it's usually on a CPM basis, right? So to me, I'd be pissed if a vendor only measured 1 in 10 and didn't measure the other 9 in 10 or 99 and 100 and still
charge you for them.
Well, yeah, but charge you for all 100, right? So
right.
So those are some very basic things that you should just not assume. You should just go ask.
So ask and show your work. I love that one.
Yeah.
All right, Jay.
Yeah, and I think so. Number one, it's is post JavaScript standard, and and what percent? How do you measure and reconcile the pre and the post? I think the measured versus monitored is really important, and that should be very high. And then I would say, like, to what's the granularity that we get to see in terms of detail, because I don't want to just see a domain report. Like, that's completely not helpful. Mm-hmm. And so I think granularity is probably the third point.
So going back to our conversation about measuring outcomes, there's a question in the Q&A around, are there case studies where actual sales rates increased once you start to remove the fraud that previously existed? So said another way, if other providers are letting in fraud, once a client switches to Fu or other better measurement, the spend should start to generate more actual sales. Is that something you've seen with your data?
Absolutely. There's many case studies. Often we can't really publish it because it's client data, but I can corroborate that if you're tracking actual sales, you will see an increase in sales if more of your ads are shown to humans. Basic common sense, right? But there is a complication there, right? We were talking about earlier where some of the vendors are falsifying or claiming credit for sales that they didn't actually cause, right? For sales that had already occurred. So again, in the Uber case, right, they were getting a huge amount of app installs for the Uber app, but those apps were already installed. They were simply falsifying the attribution, right? So in those cases, I have to qualify. If you are actually tracking actual sales, then yes, you should see that going up. But if you're now saying, oh, well, this vendor already claimed credit for 60% of our sales, then it might actually go back down, right? Because you're now measuring it more accurately to say, yes, these were caused by the digital marketing that we're doing, right? Not falsified and all that kind of stuff.
If you are starting from point A on determining ad fraud within your campaigns, what would be the first thing you would look out for in order to determine what campaigns are subject to a lot of fraud? I'm going to assume this person may not be using a post bid, the JavaScript there. So what are some other things that they can look for as like a sign that there might be some fraud afoot?
Basically, there's things like the audience network. So Facebook audience network, if that is on, you can be sure that you'll have 90% fraud in there, right? Because if the ads run on Facebook, yes, there's a bunch of humans still logged into Facebook and Instagram all day long. Okay, so yes, some of those will be shown to humans. But if you let the audience network run, that means that's all these sites outside of Facebook and all the apps outside of Facebook that are just chomping on your impressions, right? So you can be sure you'll have tons and tons of fraud in there. Same thing for Google Video Partners if you're running on YouTube, Google Search Partners if you're running Google Search, and LinkedIn Audience Network, right? All of those things are simple solves, right? You can eliminate or avoid 90 to 99% of the fraud simply by turning those off. Okay, there may be some very edge cases where you may want to leave those on. But again, in order for you to do that, make sure you have the right analytics in place so that you can actually see what the hell you're getting, right? Again, there doesn't need to be very complex things that you need to do, right? Some of these things are obvious answers, but again, you probably won't be told those answers by others because they want you to spend all the money, right? There's other kind of hidden incentives that kind of muddy up the stuff. But in this case, it's like, yeah, just turn the audience network off and see if that makes your campaigns better.
Yeah. The other thing is if you're starting from point A, call Foo and say, I'll buy you a cup of coffee one day. Can I get a small no charge test? And if your eyes don't, pop out of your head with enlightenment, then don't use it. And no harm, no foul. You guys don't have to talk again. But everybody who I've spoken with who's worked with you has, or who's done that first step has said, okay, this is a no-brainer.
I'm going to call this one our last question to wrap up. And so this question is, what new technology are you most excited about, or new ad tech company to help eliminate fraud in the programmatic media supply chain? Basically, who is catching your eye on doing it right?
Well, and I know Foo's answer, but I'll let you go ahead.
Oh, interesting. I'd like to hear what you think my answer is going to be. But bottom line is, I actually think it's you, the advertiser, you, the small business owner, because there's no technology, including mine, that's going to actually do that job for you. If you don't care about your data enough to look at it, when you want to, it's not like you have to look at it 8 hours a day. I look at it 8 hours a day, 10 hours a day, because I want to. I actually enjoy the data. And I enjoy kind of being the crime scene, investigator to find the crimes, right? So I enjoy looking at that, and that's why I've been able to do this for 12 years straight. But you are the one who is responsible and has the ability to make your campaigns better. There's no one else out there who can actually do that for you.
Yeah, and I will say to that end, I remember as a kid, my parents got me a tennis racket, and it was a very average tennis racket. And I was convinced that the only reason I wasn't really good at tennis was because I didn't have the racket that some of my friends had that was really, really expensive. But what I've learned is that, I don't know who all the all the cool tennis people are today, but whether it's Sampras or John McEnroe, it doesn't, whatever, from 80 years ago.
Yeah.
But
yeah,
the best tennis players in the world can play with an average racket, and they're going to whoop me no matter if I have the best racket or not. And so the tool is helpful, but the tool is not the lead in what will do it. And to your point, it is the person. And like, to your point, I can buy the best drill in the world, but someone who drills all day long and does this stuff is going to be able to do it 10 times better than me with your average Milwaukee or DeWalt drill from Home Depot. So I agree with you. I thought you were going to say to ADM DSP. I know we've got Russell on the line here.
No, I'll just basically say we're here to help. Right. So if you need our help, we are here to help. We have a platform that will be kind of an analytics platform to help you see the data better. And Goodway and Jay, you have the team members. So if people need consulting and need expertise, you have the people who have looked at the data before, so they can definitely help you get started. So I think we are just here to help and provide you with the right tools and expertise to get you going.
Well, go ahead, Jay.
Let me just finish off. There's 2 more questions that we can answer very quickly. Which channels do you see the most fraud? Well, most money, probably CTV is where it's like crazy nuts. And then pixel stuffing, you could probably Google Dr. Fu pixel stuffing, and there'll be 4 LinkedIn articles that explain everything you ever wanted to know.
Yes.
Thank you very much for all of your insights. Thank you all for attending. Please feel free to reach out if you have questions. Thank you. This was fun.
You got it. Thanks all. Bye now.
All right.
Bye-bye.